Hi everyone, my name is Ximena Camacho and I work at the University of Melbourne. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share some of the work that I've been doing with collaborators from my own university, from the University of New South Wales, and from the Institute for Clinical Evaluative Sciences. And we've created a network to support the Australian drug regulator, the Therapeutic Goods Administration, or TGA, with some rapid evidence generation work. So regulatory agencies, including the TGA, generally work based on a cycle that starts with a potential safety signal. This can come from a number of different sources, such as adverse drug reaction reports, from post-approval studies, from the media or other sources, or from peer-reviewed literature. And from this last source, safety signals are increasingly being identified from observational studies that use administrative health data. These signals then go through a prioritization exercise. Regulatory agencies, like other organizations, only have a finite amount of resources, so they need to prioritize some issues based on the strength of the emerging evidence for the signal and on the potential public health impact. The prioritized signals then move on to an investigation phase where the agencies review available evidence, they consider the pharmacological mechanism of action and biological plausibility, and they reach out to international agencies to see whether any other jurisdictions may have investigated the issue as well. Once all of the evidence has been compiled, the regulator will then decide how to respond. If the potential safety signal is determined to be a true association, then there are a few different actions they can take as a regulator, and those generally depend on the seriousness of the adverse event. So for example, they can update the product information and communicate the risk, or take stronger options such as upscheduling medication, for example, from over-the-counter to prescription only. So regulators need evidence, and we have these large linked population data sets that are already available, and these lend themselves to rapid evidence generation. So for example, we could use prescription claims data to ascertain exposure to a particular medication. We could identify outcomes from hospitalization or emergency department or physician visit records, and we can get basic demographic information from population registers. In our experience working with drug regulators in Canada and the United States, we've also seen that some questions from regulators can be addressed pretty quickly by analyses that are restricted to users of the medicines in question, so exposed cohorts only. And these kinds of analyses provide a sense of the utilization of a drug and the prevalence of events among the exposed population, and they can be undertaken and completed pretty quickly. Most of the time, these types of analyses can provide all of the evidence that regulators need. So for example, a finding that very small numbers of individuals were exposed to a drug of interest, or that there were very few outcomes in the cohort of drug users, is clearly informative from a public health standpoint. Or a finding that an event rate in the exposed group is low versus the event rate in the general population indicates that there's not likely to be a major association between a drug and an outcome. And if the exposed population is sick with many competing risks or high mortality, so for example, the way it is with certain cancers, then any risk of the drug toxicity might be minor compared to the effects of the underlying disease. And finally, if there are enough numbers to allow for the calculation for crude measures of association, then this can lead to evidence of a potential signal and therefore indicate that there's merit in proceeding to a more thorough analysis. Ideally, we would use data from Australia for these rapid evaluations since it reflects local prescribing practices and we are supporting the Australian drug regulator after all. However, there are challenges with data access within Australia, which can make it difficult to generate evidence in a timely manner. But when the question from a regulator relates to the drug or the molecule itself, rather than how the drug is used, then the location is irrelevant and we can leverage data that's available from other jurisdictions to address the question. And the side benefits of this is that we may also find that other jurisdictions have more years of information. So for example, if drugs are approved or listed on formularies earlier, we might also find that more data is available if more drugs within a particular class are listed on a formulary, and prescribing practices may be similar within jurisdictions. For this particular network, we leveraged data on the Ontario population that was available to us through the Institute for Clinical Evaluative Sciences and the connections to other regulatory and drug safety evaluation networks, such as the Canadian Network for Observational Drug Effect Studies. So the way that we've set up this network starts with a query from the TGA. We then perform an initial triage based on the knowledge and expertise of our collaborators at Melbourne Uni and UNSW and identify whether a question is infeasible or whether it needs to be parked until more data is available. So for example, for drugs that have recently been approved or need longer follow-up, or whether the query is worth exploring further. And this decision can usually be made in a couple of days and gets reported back to the TGA. For those questions that can move ahead, we then perform some high-level feasibility assessments based on the Ontario context and any summary information that's available to us, but we're not touching any individual level data at this stage. So this would involve identifying any ongoing or planned work that might overlap with the query. And if that's the case, then we'll connect the TGA with the team working in that area. We also look at whether the question can potentially be addressed at all. So for example, can we ascertain the outcome of interest, or does the study period align with the data that was available to us, and so forth. And then we'll also review the formulary listing date to make sure that the drug has been available for long enough to even observe the outcome. And we look at the number of claims per quarter, which gives us a rough sense of the potential number of exposed individuals, and therefore an indication of the feasibility of undertaking some preliminary analyses. And then again, at this point, we'll make a decision as to whether to go ahead with some analysis or whether it's infeasible, and then again, communicate that decision back to the TGA. And this can usually be done within about a week or so. So once we decide to go ahead with the feasibility analysis, we'll co-design the analytic plan with the TGA, and we'll submit it for internal approval at the Institute, which takes about 2 weeks or so to turn around. Once that approval is in place, then an analyst will be able to access the individual level data and then define a cohort of exposed individuals and look at outcomes among that group. Wherever we can, we'll calculate crude measures of association like relative risks. And the analysis is designed to take less than a week of analyst time and give us a sense of A, whether there appears to even be a signal, and B, whether there are enough numbers to proceed to a fully controlled analysis. At this point, we'll draft a summary report for the TGA with our findings, and we'll review it together with them. And then looking back at the start of the process, it's been about a 5-week period between the original query to when the TGA has information that it can use. If we do decide to proceed to a fully controlled study, this looks more like your traditional academic analytic projects with a clearly defined exposure and comparison populations and a much longer time frame. So again, we'll co-design the study plan alongside the TGA to make sure we're looking at the measures they need. And at this point, we'll request remote access to the data and do the analysis locally. As soon as it's done, we'll put together a summary report for the TGA outlining what we found. And once that report's been finalized and the TGA has whatever they need to inform their regulatory response, at that point, then we'll work on preparing academic outputs like manuscripts and abstracts for publication. And because we've done this collaboratively with the TGA, then we usually consider them to be co-authors with any of the products that we produce. So although we've anchored this process in the Ontario data, we still have an eye on whether we can undertake any aspects of this work in the Australian context. The TGA does have some data available to it internally, so they might be able to undertake some analysis themselves, or there might be data already available to the academic teams under existing projects that could be used, obviously with the appropriate ethics amendments. So if either of these turn out to be the case, then we'll simply adapt the protocol from the Ontario work to the Australian data and go through the same process. This has worked out really well for us in the past because it's helped to build some capacity, both within the TGA as well as among our university groups. So over the past 2 years, we've managed to address a total of 20 queries across 2 separate rounds. 7 of those were infeasible. There were insufficient number of claims, or the outcomes weren't ascertainable from the admin data. In 4 situations, there was work already underway, and we made arrangements to share those results with the TGA whenever they were available. And out of the remaining studies that were feasible, 3 of them only had sufficient numbers for feasibility studies, but with one of them, we were able to proceed to a fully adjusted study, and most of them were able to be repeated in the Australian data. So we found this to be a really positive relationship, and what we found to have really contributed to the success of the network, we're really establishing a true partnership. So this is co-development of the analytic plan and alignment of the approaches and measures to make sure that everyone got what they needed out of it. We generated really simple reports. So something like an executive summary with supporting analysis with non-technical jargon and easily communicated upwards. And we've kept decision makers in the loop and provided relevant information as soon as we had it available. So in other words, we didn't wait to publish before providing the results. This also has the added benefit of now the TGA knows that they can reach out to us if and when they have queries that need quick answers. Thank you so much for watching this session. I hope it provided a useful framework that you can build on as you set out to engage with governments and decision makers in your own areas.